So this week we're going to talk about production. And it's important that you understand the conceptual idea of what we're going to try to do from a macro perspective before we go into the more detailed equations. So essentially, any production process is very basic. It works in the following way. You take some inputs, let's say labor, and machines, which economists usually call capital, and then you enter them into, you use them in some way, so you kind of throw those inputs into this box that we call production process, and then voila, you produce some output. If it's cars, it's cars. If it's you have a coffee shop, it's coffee cups. You have a hair salon, it's hairdressers. If you have a church, it's t-shirts. Whatever you're producing. For instance, in the production process of your studying for an exam, you take your labor, your time that you use for studying, the textbook, the times that you went to class, your intelligence. All of those are inputs that you use. You study in some way as a production process, and you produce good answers or correct answers in the exam. So we can think about any production of anything. It could be production on a company or production of an individual producing anything like a correct answer to an exam. It works in the same way. So the important process that we're going to study here is essentially what happens in this box. All right? This is what changes, is how a company uses its inputs to produce this output. This is what we're going to cover in this chapter. Now, this is a very important process because of two things. The company essentially wants to do one thing. They want to produce a particular output at a minimum amount of cost. But in order to do that, they're constrained by the way they do things, by the way they actually produce things. In other words, they're constrained by how many units they can produce by using a particular number of inputs. The most basic way we can kind of mathematically model that is by saying that the output the company produces, we call that Q, is going to be a function of two types of inputs. Labor, which are inputs that you can change pretty quickly, we call that variable inputs. And then capital, which we usually use a K, which are inputs that take a little longer to change. Machines, plant, and equipment usually take a little longer to be able to change than hire or fire some employees. So essentially, once you have this framework, what you're essentially going to be working with is with this production process, which is constraining for the company, that happens in this particular box in here. And remembering that what the company wants to do is to get out as much output as they can by reducing the cost of producing it, constrained by the fact that they have to use a certain amount of inputs to do that. So it's going to get kind of complicated with a lot of equations later on, but that is essentially what we're going to be studying in this chapter.